We're back with Grazel Garcia of GGPA, and today we're going to be talking about all things ADHD. So, first up, Grazel, I know you've written the book on ADHD and couples therapy quite literally. How do people with ADHD tend to treat their partners?
Um, I think maybe it's better to start with how does ADHD traits affect their treatment of their partners? And I think there's a lot of ways to explain this, to narrate it in a um, more concisely. I think it's really important for couples to look at their partners who have ADHD to see whether the traits of ADHD is managed. Because if it is managed, then there's going to be less relational distress. If it is unmanaged traits, then the person with ADHD can be affected by their own ADHD traits, which then will affect their partners. It's the ADHDers is what, they call themselves. Um, are not doing something negatively intentionally to their partners. Um, just the unmanaged traits of ADHD, which is inattentiveness and hyperactivity, can affect the intimacy. So that's the most concise way I can explain that. And the most important part is that it's not done intentionally.
Yeah, and I mean that's such a huge thing to remember when you're in um, that kind of relationship where one person is neurodivergent and the other person isn't. Um, So, what sort of patterns could show up in a relationship like that, where one partner's got ADHD and maybe the other partner sees it as disinterest or not caring or not listening or all that kind of thing? What typically shows up?
Yeah, so an unmanaged ADHD trait of inattentiveness can manifest in distractibility and being hyper focused on one thing, but not so hyper focused or focus on their partners. And that can be misinterpreted, or that trait can be misattributed to not caring about their non-ADHD partner, or that their non-ADHD partner maybe start to feel like they're not important enough. If if the person with neurodivergence is focusing on something that is of interest to their ADHD brain, it can make the non-ADHDer feel like they're not a priority. That's a big one. Um, Sometimes inattentiveness can also show up in conversations, where if the mind of the ADHD are become distracted, then it can seem like they're not fully present in the conversation. And that can affect their partner thinking as if they're not listening or not caring about what the conversation is about.
Mhm.
Um, and there's a lot more things. So it's really important for someone who has ADHD to know whether they're in the inattentive type, or if they're in the hyperactive type, or if they're combined type.
Okay, so that's really interesting to hear you talking about kind of inattentive and hyperactive. So with ADHD, there's two broad camps of how your ADHD expresses. Is that right?
Yes, there's some parallels, but there's a difference where hyperactivity can, there's a lot of motor activity in the body that needs to be expelled. So sometimes the hyperactivity can show up in talking a lot and feeling restless, and that can also show up in being inattentive because the mind is so distracted. So it's also really important to know if if the ADHD has some type of um, uncontrollable anger, it may be because there's just a lot of motor activity in the body, and it's kind of hard to manage. And sometimes it can show up as, uncontrollable anger. But it's, if they don't know they have ADHD, they may think that they may pathologize themselves or be pathologized by other people. So it's really important to get the correct diagnoses if they feel that they're exhibiting traits of ADHD.
Hmm. And I think this might be quite common across all kinds of neurodivergence, but you get into that situation where you're trying to fit in with the rest of society, and then you can feel like you're constantly coming up short. But
Mm.
what strengths do ADHDers really bring to the table in relationships?
There are so many strengths. Thanks for asking that, Scott. I think this is really important in affirming that different neurotypes have their own strengths, and neurodivergents definitely have a ton of strengths that they carry that sometimes goes invisible in the way that neurotypicals look at neurodivergence, right? So creativity, spontaneity, their ability to be able to go with the flow, their excitedness can bring up the room, light up the room. Their the brain's ability to look for novelty can make someone really, really, really special in the beginning of dating or in a new relationship energy. It's different though. It's not love bombing, but it's when the ADHD brain is engaged in something new, there's a ton of energy that's related to feeling excited, and they can hyper focus on something so well that you can feel very special or that you're just the only one that exists in that moment. That's the strength, you know. Not a lot of people can do that. So also I think they are good at paying attention to different imp different tasks and giving it the same level of arousal.
Hmm.
So it can feel like everything is important, and that can be a strength in other aspects of life, but also can be a weakness in other aspects of life. So they need to know how to use it.
Yeah, I mean, it's good you kind of say that you've got strengths in some areas, weaknesses in other areas, but that's like anyone. There's
Hmm.
there's no huge difference there. Um, with ADHD, and I wonder if this is more in children than adults, but we often hear of kind of real emotional meltdowns and things like that. A lot of emotional reactivity, a lot of sensitivity, particularly in children with ADHD. Do you find that in adults as well?
Um, Nowadays, with more literature coming out, research coming out, ADHD is no longer a diagnosis for children only. It is also a common occurrence, a common diagnosis for adults. Um, are there meltdowns in adults as well? Absolutely. Absolutely. I think the traits, you know, carry on to from childhood to into adulthood, but there's some shifts that happen because there are some traits that are more present in children, and then as we age into adulthood or into maturity, some of the inattentive traits can lessen, but doesn't mean it's void of the trait.
Hmm.
Does that make sense when I say it? It's
Yeah.
just as we age and we grow into maturity, some of the traits can lessen, but it's still there. For example, um, like, sometimes with inattentive brain, they can be impatient when they're children because they're still trying to build that internal security. While in adulthood, there's many factors that play into our patience, and we've learned to be patient in some aspects, so the inattentivity can feel more managed
Mhm.
because of age,
Yeah.
but it's still there.
Yeah. As you're developing as a child, you, as you say, you have to sort of build up that internal resilience and that understanding that this big feeling I'm feeling doesn't mean I'm in danger. It's just a feeling, and that just takes time to kind of process. How does that kind of emotional reactivity as an adult show up in interactions with your partner? Like, Give me some examples of what might happen.
Right. And I like that you're naming it as not impulsivity, but you're reframing it as, well, you said emotional reactivity, but in affirming language, we're trying to use emotional intensity.
Mhm.
So from impulsivity to emotional intensity or emotional reactivity, it's more affirming than the impulsivity, but it really under the category of the traits, it's falling under the impulsivity. And again, as we age, the impulse to react becomes less because we're able to take a pause
Mhm.
more when we're older, right?
Yeah.
Emotional reactivity and impulsivity can show up in relationships in many different ways, especially if they're already feeling overwhelmed. That uh, space of pausing and reacting becomes a lot smaller.
Mhm.
So it can show up in many ways. It could be, especially if the cycle, the neurodiverse interactional cycle is has been going on for a while. Any neutral feedback can be perceived as if it's a criticism. So the emotional response to that can be a little bit more intense and reactive. So I'm making my explanation to your answer a little broad
Mhm.
because it can show up in many different ways.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And so when you're in that situation and say your partner's an ADHDer, how can you both work towards building that understanding to kind of make the relationship work a bit better, to make those inattentive traits kind of feel less personal and sort of find that way through together? What's the best way?
First, I think you're doing your own self-assessment, right? Understanding what your triggers are. So looking within yourself, and if there's a conflict or if you feel emotionally disconnected from your partner, it's always good to ask, what's happening for me? Taking that pause and saying, let me check in with myself. What's happening for me? Why is my partner's behavior that may be related to the ADHD is so activating for me? Have I personalized it? And if your answer is yes, then it's good to take a pause and understand what makes this so personal for me. And that would be the second step.
Mhm.
And the third thing is, okay, I know why this is so personal because it might be related to my attachment insecurity that started from before I met my partner
Mhm.
and from childhood. And so it's really important that these neurodivergent traits, when they show up relationally and it affects you, it's really important to know that this will activate attachment insecurities from the past. They're not that separate. They're together. However, the therapist that's working with you needs to be able to see both and
Mhm.
not just one or the other.
Yeah, and that's why it's if you're in that situation, it's really important to work with a therapist like yourself and like your team at GGPA who really are trained and educated and aware of these issues and how it, it's such a unique couple dynamic, isn't it?
Mhm. Yes, yes, it is. It is a unique, but also at the same time, like you said earlier, everybody has their own weaknesses and strengths. If we all are able to look at each other and say, hey, we're different, but we don't have to feel emotionally disconnected,
Mhm.
that's a good start,
Yeah,
right? So
absolutely. And that's a great point to end on. So thank you so much for your time again, Grazel, and we'll speak again soon.
speak again soon. Thanks, Scott.